Hi, this is Teddy, and today you're listening to Kate Andersen Brower, author of Team of Five, on Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast Podcast Network.
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast family of podcasts, and I am on today with author Kate Andersen Brower, who's the author of a new book called Team of Five, The President's Club in the Age of Trump. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so thank you for joining me. I want to talk some about this book, and I think it tells us a whole lot about what's going on in the world right now, but could you start by telling us a little bit about how you got interested in presidents and the White House? You've written a few books now on the presidency and the residents of the White House and the First Lady. So how did you get into this?
Well, I was a reporter at Bloomberg News, and I covered the White House during President Obama's first term. And I left right at the beginning of 2013, so right when he was reelected. And I was just always really interested in what goes on behind the scenes at the White House. And I covered the First Lady and Joe Biden at the time when he was vice president. And I went to a lunch with about a dozen other female reporters who covered the First Lady. And it's still mostly female reporters, sadly. And she had this rapport with this butler who walked in and out of the family dining room on the state floor of the White House. And it made me kind of think about the people behind the scenes. So that's why I wrote my book, The Residents, about the butlers, and kind of tracked down a bunch of these amazing, mostly African-American men who have served in the White House for decades, and talk to them about their experiences and what they've seen. And so from then I started to write about First Ladies and then the vice presidency, and kind of looking at the presidency through a different lens.
Yeah, that's really cool. And it's always shocking to me that so many of the people who work in the residence are just there term after term, have served all sorts of different presidents, different parties. They must have really interesting stories.
Oh my gosh, they have incredible stories. One of them, Wilson German, just passed away. He was 91 years old, but he had the coronavirus. And he, had these incredible stories. He started working in the Eisenhower administration, and he served the Obamas, and just describing what it was like. He grew up during segregation, and to just think of having the first African-American president and first lady and what that meant to the staff. And then they were very emotional on Inauguration Day, understandably. And I think it's important to capture that. And some of those folks are still there now. They stay on, like you said, from one president to the next. And I know there's one butler at the White House who I would love to interview, who is apparently close with Trump, but he was also close with Obama and Bush and Clinton. It's crazy.
And so then this most recent book that came out a few weeks ago is about the sort of President's Club, this club of former and often current living presidents. How did you get the idea to write this book?
Well, looking at Inauguration Day when Trump was sworn in, and just, how surreal that was for so many of us. And then seeing the Obama's helicopter take off from the Capitol, and thinking about what that's like for any former president and first lady to go from being the most powerful person in the world to being in semi-retirement. And then at the same time for Obama to have to kind of negotiate this new reality where he's being attacked on Twitter all the time by the sitting president in a way that we have never seen before. So I wanted to explore what that's like. And I interviewed President Trump for the book. And I guess one of the main things I wanted to find out was if he had any newfound empathy for these men who came before him. I feel like you sit in the Oval Office and you must feel some sense of, you are following in these huge footsteps. And his answer was, maybe not surprisingly, no, that he does not feel that, obviously, right?
Were you surprised that you were able to get an interview with him? It seems he's so different, and you portray this in the book, and the way that he relates to the presidency, the way he relates to these former presidents. Did you think you would be able to get in and sit down and have this conversation with him?
No, not at all, because it's so difficult. I mean, as you know, when you're trying to book a former president, it's as hard as getting an interview, with the Queen of England or something. It is really tough. And they have layers of aides around them, advisors who are deciding whether it makes sense. And with Trump, I just emailed Sarah Sanders, whom I had never met before, and, gave her kind of an elevator pitch. And she said, okay, well, what time do you want to talk to him? And I was like, him? Really? I think that does just kind of go to show that he loves this topic because he wants to talk about how he's done so much more than they have, right? And they don't want to talk about him. I mean, Bush and Obama do not want to give him any more oxygen. And even getting to talk to their advisors, which I eventually did, but it was tough. I mean, they feel like every time they, openly are critical of Trump, and Bush really never is, that it just kind of fuels Trump's supporters, and it's not helpful.
Yeah, speaking of Trump supporters, I looked at the Amazon reviews of your book, and they're overwhelmingly very positive, but there's a few who call you deep state and biased. Yes.
Right?
Did you expect that kind of reaction?
I mean, I wrote a critical op-ed about Melania Trump, and that was the worst backlash I'd ever gotten before. And people were saying I worked for George Soros and all, and I'm sure you've gotten some of this too. I mean, people are just, my book, The Residents, came out in 2015. And that honestly, it might as well have been 20 years ago. Like, it was such a different climate back then. And there wasn't this kind of divisiveness and this idea that you can't write about the presidency without some real agenda. And I didn't have a big agenda going into this, but there's an obvious contrast between the 5 men in this book and the sitting president, right? You just can't deny that.
So what do you think that striking difference between the previous presidents and the current one sort of does to inform us about the current situation? I mean, when you wrote the book, obviously we weren't in the pandemic yet. The George Floyd thing hadn't happened yet. But what, how does it sort of help explain what's going on right now?
I think that, Trump was really unprepared for a crisis. And so we saw that with his mismanagement of the pandemic, his refusal to ask for advice ever is different, and I talk in the book about how Obama didn't call, Clinton as much as Clinton would have liked, right? And it's not like a big kumbaya thing where all of these men are on some kind of text chain, they are not super close in a personal way, most of them, but at least they have respect for each other, and they have historically reached out for advice when they've needed it. And the fact that Trump just has this scorched earth mentality, I think we see it playing out, and I think it's been very bad for the country. And it will be interesting if Biden's elected, because he's so different. And, he has these relationships with Republicans, and I had interviewed him for another book, and he talked about his his relationship with Mike Pence, and that he could talk to Pence, and how that's so different from Trump, that Trump has just burned every single bridge. And, it's made it so that everything is a fight now. And I think it's just distracting us from what's important.
So what will happen, what do you think will happen if Biden is elected in this transition? You talk some about the transitions that happen between presidencies, and even when it's a shift of party, which it often is, that it's usually cordial, it's usually professional. What might it look like this time around?
I think that, I think it'll be more important than ever if Trump is reelected, for the former presidents and first ladies to show up, right, to give us a sense of consistency. And I think they probably would, because God, I mean, if Hillary Clinton could go to the last inauguration, she could go to this one. But I think that, if Biden is elected, I can't imagine Trump sitting, on the steps of the West Front of the Capitol and seeing a sea of people just so thrilled that he's leaving. Like, I just think that that would be such an ego blow to him. And a lot of our interview was spent where he's very defensive about what his place among these other presidents, and the fact that George W. Bush said of his inauguration speech, he called it some weird shit, right? He was like horrified, and they were all horrified. And I think Trump feels like he is just an outcast. And he told me he was really happy that he was invited to Bush's funeral, that he thought Bush was a wonderful man, but that, he had to say bad things about Jeb and George W., but that's just the way politics is. So to him, this is like a game, but I think he's just taken it so far that there is no level, there's no going back now. So I don't know. I mean, if Biden's elected, and it looks like the polls right now are really good for him, right? I just can't see Trump going to his inauguration, and that will be a really incredible moment in history, I think, to see a sitting president not attend, the new president swearing in. I think it'll be really sad.
So you mentioned that Biden is, sort of the polar opposite of Trump in this, but not everybody who ran for the Democratic nomination would have been, quite as different as Biden is, would have fit into the sort of old boys club quite as well. Do you think there's something about that is sort of the reason that the Democratic voters sort of are flocking back to Biden? This is what the old familiar thing looks like, because, I can't imagine like a Bernie Sanders being quite as chummy with, the former presidents, so is there something to that, do you think?
Yeah, Bernie Sanders would be much more like the Jimmy Carter of the group. And there's all these great photos. And the cover of my book is of these 5 former presidents. And Jimmy Carter is kind of off to the side. And it's really hard to even find a photo where he's that close to the other ones. I mean, he is always kind of off to the side. I could see Bernie Sanders would not have been chummy with any of them. I think people do. I think people are nostalgic for the past. And it's not to say that these men were all saints by any means, but there's just a kind of grudging admiration that they have for each other. Even when things are really bad, they end up calling each other and asking for help, or, the best example, and I think one of the more interesting parts of the book, because I was surprised by it, is the last president who George H.W. Bush saw before he passed away was Barack Obama. And it wasn't his own son. It wasn't Bill Clinton. It was, a man from a different race, decades younger, different party. But the two of them had this respect for one another. And so I think we do want to see, I think most people want to see a return to that kind of admiration and at least baseline respect that these men have. I mean, is that your take too? Because that's certainly what I'm seeing and feeling myself.
Yeah, I think so. I of course deeply wanted a woman to be the next president, which would have changed things dramatically, I think.
Me too.
But I think that there is so much of the country that just wants sort of a return to, it's not going to be normalcy. If Biden is president, it's not going to be like we suddenly turn back the clock 4 years. But I think that's what it feels like in some sense, that we could have some sort of return to some part of what, felt normal prior to that.
Absolutely. And I think that, listen, I mean, Biden's going to pick a woman, probably a woman of color, right? And that is going to change things up. I think people really want to see just a cabinet that's more reflective of this country, which is not all older white men, right? And I think that that's going to be a really important thing. And I wrote a book about the vice presidency. And I think that, it's often been a punchline, but in this election, it's going to be more important than ever before, because Biden's going to be the oldest, if he wins, the oldest president ever inaugurated, and he'll be 78 years old. So he needs a strong vice president and somebody who kind of I think speaks to this feeling that people have of unrest. And I'm really curious to see who he picks. Have you guys done shows about that? I'm sure you have.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it some. I think what's interesting to me is what qualities do we think do make a strong vice president? And it's going to be different this time around. If he said he'll pick a woman. If he's picking a woman of color, the experiences they've had are going to be different than anyone who's been vice president before. Having looked at vice presidents, what qualities do you think are going to be important? What does it mean to be a strong vice president? What might that look like?
Well, there was a really interesting memo that Ron Klain showed me, and he was a Biden advisor, and he's still working with him now. And it was a note that Biden and Obama shared, and it was basically Biden's kind of ground rules, and there were 5 of them. But one of them is that he would be in every meeting that he wanted to be in, and that he would have no portfolio. He would just be part of every discussion. And he, famously said he would be the last person in the room all the time. And when I talked to him, he said, he didn't mean that figuratively. He meant literally, like he would be the last person there when decisions were made. And so I think when he's looking for a vice president, he's going to want somebody who he has a very strong personal relationship with, which is the only reason why Kamala Harris is somebody who would make sense on paper. I just wonder if that debate where, she really went after him, if that's going to make it harder for him to pick her, if they have a good personal relationship, if they've moved on beyond that. Because I think since he's been vice president for 8 years, he knows better than anyone what he's looking for, right? So I think it's going to be important to him that whoever it is can step and fill his shoes at a moment's notice, but also that they respect him as a person. And so he's not going to want somebody who he feels like is kind of grudgingly on the ticket. They have to really want it.
Well, then he should pick Stacey Abrams because she's made it pretty clear.
Yes, right. She'd be perfect.
Yeah. And you've written about first ladies as well. So Melania seems like such a departure, especially from what first ladies, had been doing in the previous 20 years or so. But Jill Biden seems like she would be much more a return to, especially the mold of first lady that we saw with Michelle Obama or with Hillary Clinton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, she works, which will be amazing to see that. And I don't even think people have talked a lot about that. The fact that we'd have a first lady who has an actual job. She's a teacher, she's a college professor. We haven't had that. I think we had. Eleanor Roosevelt pretty much worked, right? But to have somebody with their own career while they are first lady is a big deal. I know Hillary Clinton. Obviously we changed that role and tried to do something different with it, but people did not accept it. I think that you're right. Joe Biden will be much more in keeping with what we expect. I think that Melania Trump is much more influential behind the scenes than people think. I know that she was very influential when they were deciding on Mike Pence as VP, and I did some reporting on that, and that she was the one saying that they needed to pick Pence because her husband had all this baggage. They needed somebody who was going to get the Christian conservatives in line. And I think that shows that she's savvier than people think, Melania, but she is not warm. And I mean, that's just undeniable. And I think that Jill Biden is much warmer, much more like a Michelle Obama or a Laura Bush, like able to connect with people, and affectionate with children and all of that I think we've kind of been missing that kind of warmth in our first lady, I think.
Do you think that would make a difference right now in the kind of moment that we're in with the pandemic, with Black Lives Matter? What would it look like to have a more vocal, more present first lady?
Well, I think if Michelle Obama were first lady, it would obviously be better because she would be able to speak to the Black Lives Matter, movement in a way that no one else can. And when, Hadia Pendleton was killed, she went to her funeral, and that was a huge moment in her time as first lady. And I think that, during the pandemic, we really didn't hear much from Melania Trump. And every now and then she would send a tweet about, that seemed always kind of tone deaf to me about, spending time with your family and enjoying your time at home or something when people are really struggling. I mean, she just has a really kind of detached way of approaching this role. And And, that's what when I wrote this op-ed for CNN, I had said that she did an interview, one of her rare interviews, where she said that the hardest part of being First Lady is the criticism and people trying to make money off of you. And to me, in studying First Ladies, the hardest part is like witnessing the devastation that people face when they lose their homes or visiting sick kids in the hospital. And it just seems so egocentric to me. So yeah, if we had Joe Biden in office right now, I think it would be just a more human face on that role.
There's a lot of attention right now, of course, on removing statues of people who were racist in the past or had other, problematic aspects. Things like removing Woodrow Wilson's name from the public policy school at Princeton. What do you think? How should we be thinking of former presidents, vice presidents? Is this way that we make them larger than life, that we, literally make statues of them and things? Is that problematic? Is that fitting? How are you sort of reacting to this move to remove names, remove statues, and what that might mean?
It's so complicated. I think it depends on the person, entirely. If you were somebody who was a traitor to the country, and was ended up, siding with the Confederates during the Civil War or something like that, that's a really, which one of the presidents, Tyler, did. I think that's something that's, clearly terrible. And then it gets more complicated with Thomas Jefferson, right? And his relationship with Sally Hemings and the slaves that he had on his plantation. I mean, that is just something that we haven't grappled with fully. And if you're, I think it depends on each person and each president. I did follow the Woodrow Wilson story, and that does make sense because he was saying and doing things that were even racist, even considering the time that he was president, because you do put it in the context. But some of what he said at the time was, even out of the norm of what one would have expected, and during a time when there was, a lot of racism, and there still is obviously a lot of racism in this country. But it's a tough question to answer. I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I have a tendency to not want to lionize anybody. Mm-hmm. But, on the other hand, I think it's possible. I like that idea of sort of contextualizing it in the time and place. If it was like Washington owned slaves and that's terrible and slavery is never okay, but it makes more sense in his time than it would have later, so I think you're right that it's complicated, but I'm okay with removing all statues of everybody.
Me too. I mean, we do put a lot of these people on a pedestal. I was listening to, she's a great comedian, but she was talking about Picasso and how Picasso is like, everyone thinks he's just amazing, but he was actually, kind of a jerk. And there were a lot of other artists who were more talented, you could say, than he was. But for some reason, we kind of put certain people on this pedestal and like, as you said, lionize them, and there's no getting rid of it. And there's so many more people who would be worthy of that kind of praise that will never get it, which is kind of sad.
So last question from me is, tell me about this relationship between George W. Bush and Michelle Obama. What the heck's going on there?
I mean, it is a really sweet relationship, right? And it is a genuine friendship. They do get along. I mean, they sit next to each other at events because of that's just the way it is with protocol, that the lineup is always that she's going to be sitting, next to him. So that's where they started talking. And, the whole exchanging of mints and then the hug at the Smithsonian African American History Museum was very intentional, that people I talked to said that they both do really like each other. And when Obama went to George H.W. Bush's funeral, Bush gave her this huge bear hug and he didn't greet anyone else with that same, warmth. But it's also done so that we can see it. It's right. It's so that we can see that that there is this friendship and that crosses party lines and gender lines and everything else. And so I do think it's genuine. By all accounts it is, but there is an undertone to it that it's something more too, and that both of them realize that it's more important now than ever for people to see these very sweet interactions between the two of them.
Yeah. No, it's lovely when you see it. But
yeah.
I'm always like, I couldn't be that nice to him, but okay.
Yeah, the mince especially, it's just so human, right? It's like what we're missing right now is just that kind of human touch that I think the Obamas really, she was just amazing at it, at making fun of herself and having fun in those late night television interviews and all of that Melania can't do. And I know that, in talking to her closest friend in the White House who says that she feels a lot of pressure to, she's following in Michelle Obama's footsteps, and who wants to do that, right? So you have a little sympathy for her. But there's so many tone deaf things she does with the Be Best campaign, this cyberbullying and all that. I just can't understand it. Really.
I met Michelle Obama once for like 20 seconds at a book signing. And I remember just it was this long line of people she was signing books for. And I was probably like 100 people into the line. But the way she looks at you and talks to you, it's like you're the only person in the world for that 20 seconds. And I was like, that, I want to figure out how to do that.
No, I know. Do you wish she had run for president?
I live in Chicago, so I would love to see Michelle be mayor someday.
Yes.
But I also can totally sympathize with her not wanting that kind of role.
Who would want that, right? It's like, in their right mind. Yeah. But she would totally win a race for mayor of Chicago, right? That would be like a shoo-in.
Yeah, I was saying the other day, it would be very strange because everyone in Chicago, of course, loves the Obamas. And I live in Hyde Park, which, is where they live when they're here. But everyone also in Chicago loves to hate the mayor. So it would be a weird tension there. How can you love her and hate her at the same time?
That's true. Look at Rahm Emanuel. He just...
Yes.
That did not go well.
No.
This is a beautiful neighborhood.
So we love it. So is there anything else that you would like to make sure that we talk about?
No, I think we covered a lot. I would just say, I guess one thing that I have in the book that I think is interesting is, there's more than one thing that I think is interesting in the book, but Obama, he has in his post-presidential offices here in DC, he has like a war room kind of set up, where they have this big conference room table in the office where they all sit, and he sits with his aides. There are more than 20 people who work for them, and both he and Michelle Obama have their adjacent offices in the building. And they meet to talk about these tweets that Trump sends out, where, the wiretapping tweet, for instance, was something that particularly upset him, where Obama actually had his staff redo the statement that they were putting out to make it even stronger. And which for, anybody who has covered Obama knows that he is so, thoughtful and careful in what he says. It takes him so long to put a statement out. And for him to actually want it to be harsher and to say, no, I absolutely would never have done that, and that goes against our democratic values. I think it shows that he is in this really unenviable position as a former president, having to constantly, see his whole administration and so much of what he accomplished completely decimated, but then to also have to kind of wage this battle where he's deciding whether or not to respond to these attacks. I think it's really fascinating, and I can't wait to read his book whenever that comes out, to see, how those decisions are made and why there are certain things he's let slide and other things he's taken on. And I just think psychologically it must be really difficult for him right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how can people buy your book?
Oh, on Amazon, or I have a website, katebrower.com. It's at Barnes & Noble and just wherever books are sold these days online.
It's a really fun read. Anyone who likes history, I think, will love it. Just getting into sort of the inside relationships between the presidents and including first ladies. And it's really, really fascinating.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to come on your show, so I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.